Okay, so thank you so much for joining the webinar. This is webinar number 7. ACCESS.SPACE Alliance has been hosting these webinars weekly for the benefit of the space sector from all over the world. I know there's a lot of people here who have registered from the Americas as well as all the way to Asia, the Far East, and also Africa, Middle East as well, Russia. And welcome to this webinar today. We're here basically to support the sector, as I said, and yourself who are home in this very difficult time. We are recording the webinar just for informing everyone. How do we proceed? We have 3 panelists, which will speak between 15 to 20 minutes each. There'll be 1 or 2 questions taken at the very end of each of the presentations. And then once the 3 panelists finish, then we will have another 10 to 15 minutes wrap-up session with Q&A from anyone on the attendees that may want to ask questions. There is a small window at the very bottom of your screen where you can actually write your question. So that's where you need to write your questions. There is no chance for you to speak because that way it's much easier for us to manage the webinar itself. However, I might call on 1 or 2 individuals to actually ask for the question. So you may prepare yourself the question if you want to ask it yourself. In terms of registration, we have basically nearly about 200 registrations today from 59 different countries. You can see from this chart we are going each week, which is good. Here's the number of countries, about 59 to 60 from all over the world. As I said earlier, I will give you this presentation tomorrow when I'll write back to you, thanking you for attending, and you'll get this presentation plus the presentation also of the panelists as well. We have different kind of people attending from the management side, from the engineering side, regulators, and also legal firms. And the way you can see from different companies attending this webinar are here on this chart. A lot of the regulators from all over the world have managed to also register themselves. You can see there's about 36 government bodies and regulators. This week's webinar will be mainly, you can see from this chart, from 2 companies which are dealing with risks and insurance, and then another company, more engineering services side, the Orbit, will make a presentation as well on their services and engineering for space. Last week's was basically a regulatory webinar, and also the future webinars starting from next week. There'll be additional precious payloads and infostellar and orbital transport. You can see that'll be next week's webinar and so forth. ACCESS.SPACE Alliance has been created already 1 year ago. The executive team was on this chart. If you need more information on the ACCESS.SPACE Alliance, please let me know. You have my emails on this chart. I can provide you more details on who we are, what we do, but mainly we represent a small satellite and small space sector globally. I'll not go through this chart. You can read it when I send you the slides. Basically, that explains what we're doing, who we are, how many organizations we are presenting so far. And here's the logos of many of those members that we currently have on our website. This will change soon. We are structuring ourselves more formally, so we will be reissuing this slide and also membership soon. In terms of memberships, about 1/3 UK members, about 1/3 European, Europe at large, about 20%, 23% from the United States, and about 10% from the rest of the world. We also promote as a company, if you have any hiring opportunity and sponsorship opportunities for students, new graduates, or if you're looking for new staff or whatsoever, please contact me and I can make aware the membership of your opportunities which are out there. So on the right side, you can see CTAIL from Italy and ACCESS.SPACE are looking for engineers and also other type of vacancies. If you're interested, please let me know, and I can put you in contact with those two companies. And also, if you have opportunities, please let me know, and I can advertise them here on this chart next week. Other activities, if you would like to distress yourself or ask your people in your company to have some distressing opportunities, look at this website, FridayArt.club. Gives you opportunities to actually use art in order to help your people to come over the difficulties of this period of time in these COVID-19 issues. Today we have three excellent panelists: Morten Pahle, Managing Director of ACCESS.SPACE, and Miguel Calvete, Director of Price, Forbes and Partners, and Bruno Carvalho, from Vice President from The Orbit in Portugal. So we will start the webinar. That's their bio. I will send this out tomorrow. And today's webinar has been sponsored by ACCESS.SPACE. Morten Pahle volunteered to sponsor this webinar. So thank you, Morten, and thank you to your company to sponsor this. So we'll start the webinar now with Bruno first, and then with Miguel, and then Morten after that. Bruno, you can start the webinar. Thank you.
Hello there.
Your flow, Bruno. If you like to show us your face through the video, you can do that as well.
I was just trying to connect. All right. There you go. Hi there. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for the introductions, and thank you, ACCESS.SPACE, for hosting this and organizing it. I've been joining every time that I can over the last 5 weeks, and it's been really useful to see what's out there. So I hope that we can spark some interest on the Orbit as well, and on ACCESS.SPACE. So thanks, Tony. The Orbit as a company that started back in 2011, and its objective is to provide in-orbit logistics. So we're looking into the full end-to-end of the mission life cycles for space missions, but particularly focused on the orbital aspect. So not just in control, but also on how you get things and payloads up to space, and how you operate those and minimize the impact of that mission on the sustainability of the actual space environment. This initial case, the Orbit started developing some components that you would attach to satellites before they were actually launched, so you could have a deorbiting the device before at the end of the life cycle of the satellite, regardless of you being in control of the satellite or not. On the back of that case study, the Orbit got some funding and some venture capital behind it. It expanded its activities to Portugal, and then to the UK and the US. It's an Italian-based company in the region of Lombardy, that's just been heavily affected by the COVID-19. Fortunately, we didn't close the facility. People were sent home, and we managed to get some exemptions about having people on site to support the activities that were ongoing. We had, however, a team in Peru preparing themselves for the launch that was supposed to happen in March on the Vega, and I'll touch upon that in a few minutes. So, as I said, you get, I think Tony mentioned that you get these slides tomorrow anyway, so don't focus too much on the text. You'll be able to have these for your own consultation. If you have any questions, then please raise your hands and shout them out at the end. So as I said, the Orbit started expanding from Italy. We're now about 80 people and growing. We are actually starting the recruitment process again, which was kind of put on hold because of the COVID-19 situation, because we had some issues with as I said, the logistics of our own activities. However, we keep pushing for our launch, and I'll touch upon that in a few minutes. So in-orbit logistics means in orbit now, and in orbit now is a first attempt at a dispenser, fully managed dispenser with its own propulsion system, where you can put your own payloads on site on this dispenser, typically from 3 U's to 12 U's. Most of these things don't have any propulsion on, and we take you to the last mile transportation after the separation of the after launch. So the idea is to allow you to have a spread of your constellation much quicker, much faster, to allow you to have different orbital positionings than the one that you would be otherwise injected into from the launcher. And that really kind of creates a lot of options to how you use this dispenser. It can be used as satellite zero of a constellation, so you can host payloads as well as releasing these payloads. So you get a fully serviced module that have all the capabilities for point, direct, and to download data. So we can use it for in-orbit validation, in-orbit demonstration of your subsystems. You can use it as a relay of communications once you raise the orbit of the dispenser itself, so you can stays above your own fleet, your own deployed assets, and you can use it at the end of its life eventually to actually go back and retrieve the assets and bring them down to deorbiting them. So again, effectively having some aspects of sustainability in mind. So how does it work? I mean, we provide a full end-to-end service. So you deliver the satellite to us. We integrate it with the launcher. We then integrate the deployer into the launch services, and we provided the mechanisms to operate the payload or the satellite as well. There are several tiers, several layers that we can interface with, because obviously there are different customers with different requirements. Some want to fly just the payload, some want to fly their satellites, some want to have just their data, and we can also cater for the build and the testing and integration of other spacecrafts as well. So what's the aim? The difference, the main difference is that typically when you see that you have a fleet, a certain number of satellites that you want to launch into a certain orbital plane, you want to space them out, and typically what happens is that you have a cluster after the initial release, and then either you allow your satellites to drift, or you have your own propulsion, which makes your subsystem a lot more your spacecraft a lot more expensive, and it takes about 6 to 10 months to have a proper deployed, dispersed constellation on a certain orbital plane. With ION, that would take a few weeks, and if you think that typically the lifetime of a small CubeSat ranges from 3 to 5 years, if you spend almost a year on the dispersion before you actually have the ability to deliver your service, then obviously you're losing revenue, and you're losing about a quarter of your life, of the life cycle of the potential life of your spacecraft. So with ION, you deploy your orbital plane in a few weeks. It obviously is more expensive than if you only piggyback on a launcher as everybody else. However, with the revenue that starts coming a lot sooner, you probably recover the costs, and you have a much smoother environment to operate, because the requirements for to launch in the ION are much catered for if you're launching directly on the base plate of any piggyback mission. So this includes the precision deployment, the low tumbling rate, fast dispersion, as I mentioned, and easy integration, because you deliver it to us. We would cater for the transportation to the launch site, insurances, and everything else. So again, what you can do with ION, as I said, change the altitude. That's the typical one. So you can be launched into low Earth orbit and then raise it to even to high medium orbits. Change the dispersion, change the orbital plane, and put all the maneuvers that require propulsion in place before you actually disperse and launch your own satellite. This is just an example of a RAN shift. As I said, Tony said, we distribute the slides, so don't bother too much on the text. So we also provide other services. So around ION launch, we have the D-Pod, which allows you to interface with different launcher providers and third-party launchers. And these are also the tubes that can fit into the ION itself. So you have just an idea of the sizes of what we can currently handle. As I mentioned as well, in orbit, the ION deployer is a service module and has a service module, fully powered satellite in itself. So once we deploy the payloads, the other satellites that go on board, you still have the capacity to do useful operations with it. So you can host payloads to test your assets really before you actually commit to building your own satellites. This makes an IOD, an in-orbit demonstration mission, much cheaper in the sense that you don't have to build a satellite around it. And you don't have to worry about licensings or either for communications or for the actual object, because ION is itself licensed to fly. So you can basically just deliver the instrument that you want to test and you want to fly. You'll see later we'll provide you also the mechanisms to operate that remotely. So you'd have access to the payload as if it were operating in an actual spacecraft even before it's launched. To do that, we developed Aurora. Aurora is a ground segment software that was developed because when back in 2017 the company had to operate its own satellite, the company asked for quotes for the typical providers of these solutions, and the quotes that we got back were roughly the half of the value of the company at the time, in the millions range, to operate a cube that we wanted to have the ability to scale up. And the company decided then to kind of virtually integrate the software control as well. The problem that we faced after that was when we launched, we want to launch ION, we want to control ION, and scaling that was a bit tricky again, because we had a monolithic solution based on servers that were on site. And we quickly realized that if you want to launch once every 2-3 months, which is the launcher opportunities that we'll have on ION, so basically 3, 4, even 5 a year, if there's demand for it, then scaling the ground segment was tricky. So you had to buy more hardware, buy more maintenance support, and so on for the kit. So we decided to deploy this into the cloud, and we did a feasibility study with ESA to try out some of the mechanisms that will be required to operate this. And what we quickly realized is that we can not only could we serve our needs, but we can also make it available to potential customers, and start about thinking around innovative solutions for a ground segment marketplace. This includes the antennas, the ground network, which we have to manage for our own purposes, because ION is not going its mission is different every time. So we are currently in partnership with Leap Space and with the Amazon ground stations to provide global coverage to ourselves and to our customers. And for that, we have to manage the ground network and allow each satellite to be attached to a communication system and to an antenna, and then control those antennas in order to point to the right satellite, to track them, and so on and so forth, to tune to the right frequencies, etc. By doing that, we also realized that we could plug in other network providers and ground infrastructure providers and allow them to monetize their availability, so their downtime. So we can program their antennas on the fly and make use of the capabilities that they have. Aurora then provides the scalability because it's deployed on the cloud, so we use the elasticity of it and the flexibility because we give you the mechanisms to actually program it yourselves and patch it and use the API to provide third-party components, be them hardware or software. And then we further evolve the concept because again we needed Aurora to be the glue of our own end-to-end mission provision, so our end-to-end mission statement, and we play in the intersection of the different components. So in space you have the mechanisms to actually have processing power on board. So we're working with to have some of the capabilities that you currently have on the ground in terms of processing on board. And on the ground, we can have different components by third parties, be them the ground stations or software components for flight dynamics and mission planning that are very specific for some missions, or even proprietary software that may require to process the data from a specific payload. And then because we're running on the cloud, then we can also make available the interfaces to other data sets and allow the correlation to happen immediately instead of having to port data from one cloud to another or to one server to another. I also must stress that we are agnostic of a cloud provider. We're currently running for our own purposes on AWS, but we can run on other cloud providers. And that is particularly of concern for some users that may require their data to be in a specific location on the globe. And also we can deploy this on private clouds, which is sometimes relevant for some applications.
Bruno, 1 more minute, please.
Yeah, I'm almost finishing. Thanks. So each circle can create its own, as I said, marketplace, and we can also use this as EGSE. It runs on mobile platforms, runs on a tablet, runs on anything that has a browser. So it provides thin clients that you can run on environments that are not necessarily accessible by big machines. We provide a development kit. So as I said, you could live with this. This is a Raspberry Pi example that we did to play. The Raspberry Pi is in a completely different location than the actual control. It's a browser thing. The Raspberry Pi is connected to Aurora, and we control the payload as if it's flying. So behind us, you can put all the simulation that you want. You can put hardware in the loop and software in the loop. But more importantly, if you're flying with us on Ion, we can deliver the payload, the instrument, and we can provide the mechanisms to develop that instrument as if you're flying on Ion once you're developing the procedures on the ground, etc. As I said, we are expected to fly on from Kourou soon. I'm going to put a pointer here. So this is our Ion. We have some 12 Planet Doves on board at the moment, so paying customer. This was the integration last March, which then the team had to pull back and fly back to the continent because of the coronavirus situation. What happened was that they spent about 14 days in quarantine in Italy. We had to remove the satellite from the deck because we had to take care of the batteries. We did not know when we would be able to fly back to launch, and the batteries, lithium batteries, are tricky to if they have the proper cycles. But the team flew back to Kourou last week, and they're spending another 14 days in quarantine in a hotel in Kourou. The launch campaign is expected to start again towards the end of next week. Sergio here is in Rome playing out with Aurora because we were actually setting ourselves up to control the satellites remotely with the control system that we have. And with this, I'll say thank you, and if there are any questions, by all means, do.
Thank you, Bruno. If you can maybe unshare the screen.
Of course.
There are two questions I have here on the app. Anonymous question: when will the first Ion vehicle launch, and on which rocket?
March and on a Vega. So it's the next March. Sorry, it was supposed to be in March on a Vega. It's launching mid-June on the next Vega mission. So well, in a couple of weeks' time, 3 weeks' time.
Okay. And next question is the following: how do you market yourself, and what are the biggest challenges you have faced for marketing your products? That's come from Hamza Baig.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we are. I mean, it's in our logo. We are new space solutions. I mean, I don't like the expression new space because gravity is the same for all, and we struggled with the same situation about having to put the products out there. So we go through the usual channels. So we do have a website where you can actually tailor the solution for your Orion, for instance, where you can say, this is the dimensions of my payload, this is the size, this is the mass. And we can the website will then provide you some mechanisms to have an idea of how much that's going to cost, and we'll interface with you directly. It has been a challenge particularly for new space cameras to put it out there, in a sense that it's a new service. So it's something that I mean, we do have one or two competitors, but we are doing something that we believe it's innovative. And at the same time, it's mostly through the usual, you know, new space channels, so social media, interface, web, and a lot of events, which this year has been a bit tricky to attend to. Okay,
thank you, Bruno. For other questions for Bruno, please save them for later at the very end. We have we have the Q&A session at the very end. You can actually write them on the Q&A window. Miguel, if you can come online. Bruno, if you can switch off your video, and then I'll have Miguel on. And you can start anytime you want, Miguel.
Sure thing. So first and foremost, thanks, Tony, for organising this. It's been very interesting, obviously, to know the various different players in the space industry, and the growing numbers week on week, obviously, a testament to the good work you're doing. So thank you first and foremost to yourself and Betty and your work that you're doing there. So I'm going to start straight in, obviously noting that we've got a time limit on the presentations that we're doing. So I'm going to go straight to basics, which is first and foremost what is space insurance, and obviously we're probably one of the least heralded players within the space satellite or the space industry, and in some instances I think probably for the newer entrants to the scene, what is our role within this chain. So essentially, looking at the basics, insurance is a form of risk transfer, involving the shifting of a pure risk from one party to another for the exchange of compensation, typically monetary in this case. So
Miguel, you want to share your screen, maybe?
It's
perfect.
There we go. Sorry about that one.
All right.
So as I was saying before, just quickly going into what insurance actually is, and then delving into space insurance into a top level overview of what we cover. So actually, before I go into this slide, I'm going to switch between the two slides, and I think it's very valuable to look at the value chain. This slide has kindly been provided to us by an insurer within the industry, but I think it perfectly encapsulates exactly where the insurance broker and the insurance markets themselves fit within the value chain. So we take the example of a satellite operator, which sits at the fourth level here. We've obviously got the ultimate consumer at the very end, if we're looking at the traditional satellite products. But there are actually quite a lot of players who I like to say are behind the curtain, who provide very valuable services. And insurance has been around for a very, very long time for satellite systems. They've actually been around since 1965. So we like to see ourselves as the enabler, the assistant to getting space projects off the ground, for lack of a better phrase. So we do form a very important part of the projects, specifically for the larger value, more traditional operators who have multi-million pound systems in place. So I just go back to the previous slide. For those who are not familiar with a space insurance broker, it's obviously, you probably like to think of us as an insurance salesman, but we're actually a lot more sophisticated than that. A lot of us have actually been around for many years. You know, some insurance brokers have been around for 30, going on 40 years, and they actually form, as I said, an intermediary between the insured party and the insurers. So our role is actually is as an enabler. It's all encompassing. We have to know the trends within the space market. We have to know the diverse insurance products that are available to cater to the risk management needs of our clients and our prospects. So we need to have a combination of skills. We need to be first and foremost commercial in understanding the requirements of our clients at whatever level of the chain. A lot of the teams have engineering capabilities, or they may contract them out, because we on many occasions we need to make loss formula which are tailored for the specific requirements of the clients. And a lot of times we need to help our clients negotiate their contracts, whether that be with launch services agencies, as well as the regulatory environment in which they function. Just an important note here as well. As I said, insurance broker is an intermediary between typically the purchaser, which is typically in this case a satellite operator, but also between with the insurers. So we have, part of our job is to maintain good relationships, good healthy working relationships with our insurers. Space insurance is hyper boutique, but there are around 30 to 35 direct space insurance companies worldwide, spread around the world in various hubs. So what are the characteristics of space insurance? I will be going into the different forms of coverage, but as you can tell, obviously, it's a very, very technical line of insurance. We've got a lot of rapidly evolving technology, whether that's new launch vehicles, constellations, custom-built satellites. It's actuarially a very, very difficult line of business to write. It's not a case of just selling an insurance product. It's a case of understanding what are the probabilities of failure. Ultimately, even though we have new technology, we're dealing with a highly volatile class of business, which are low frequency of risks being launched. Predominantly, we look at around 20 to 25 insured launches, and also a high severity in relation to that low frequency. In previous years, we've looked at the ratio has been 2 to 3 insured losses may take out the premiums collected for the entire year. So, as I said, due to the inherent risks involved in launching a satellite, we are looking at very, very volatile technology, which in turn translates to the premiums that can be charged on a launch. In terms of the insurance market, as I've touched on, it involves a lot of highly technical underwriting. Many of our underwriters have come from industry backgrounds, the likes of Thales, Airbus. A lot of the guys who work within it have got very distinguished backgrounds, and it's very very mentally stimulating to work with these guys, because we're dealing with a very highly technical line of business. So where does the broker sit? We're now focusing just on our role within the chain. Obviously, we like to see ourselves and the ideal scenario is that we're appointed at a very early phase in the life cycle of an operator or the project, and we work directly alongside the client, whether that's a satellite operator, whether that's a launch agency, or any other player who's looking to purchase insurance. We sometimes advise banks on investing in funded projects, and we have to act as a consultant in working with the various players, which may involve lawyers, financial institutions, and technical consultants. So our role is, as I mentioned before, it's highly encompassing. Traditionally, we would look at we would have to work with many insurers, as many as 20 to 25 for a risk that's worth in excess of $200 million or $300 million. Just a quick snapshot of who we are. I work for a company called Forbes. We are based in London, but we have offices around the world, based strategically in Indonesia, South Africa, Bermuda, which is considered an insurance hub, and other parts including Chile and Hong Kong. So what is our role if we're getting granular? Once we are appointed as the broker to any one client or their project, we will sit alongside the client and we will analyze the risks, bearing in mind their budget, bearing in mind their risk appetite. In some instances, clients have a more risk averse, in others less so. So we will analyze all aspects of and the characteristics of each project and the client, including looking at the mission itself, the budget available, the regulations. As you may know, obviously, in any one country may have space regulations, which may differ from one country to the other, and of course their contracts, which can have a bearing on the risks and the perils that can be insured. So once we perform the deep dive into the analysis of the risks, we prefer to sit alongside the client, and we'll devise a risk management plan. So we'll look at the various, we'll map the risk with them or assist them, looking at how to reduce the risk, how to avoid it, mitigating it, and finally any inherent risks that are left over as a result of all that will be transferred in the form of an insurance contract. So again, this slide has kindly been, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. It's kindly been provided by one of our insurers, but it neatly encapsulates what kind of coverages are available. It is obviously insurance can be purchased by any number of the players themselves. Typically, we look at the risks of the satellite owner. This is because the way that a launch contract is structured is that the owner will carry the risk for the satellite until it is delivered into orbit. So depending on what the contract says, the majority of insurance is purchased by the satellite owners. However, they can be purchased also by manufacturers, launch services providers, and typically we see this in the form of third-party liability policies. But also, once the satellites are in orbit themselves, which are looking on the right-hand side of the screen, we can look at insuring the operation of the satellite themselves. So there's quite an array of coverages that are available. Your broker is there to advise you on the pertinent coverages. What are the pricing points? Of course, insurers set their own prices depending on their analysis of the risk, which will predominantly revolve around the hardware of the satellite and how it's functioned in orbit until that moment in time. Again, just touching on who these solutions are open to. A lot of the majority of the insurance companies and the insurers, or the underwriters themselves, as we define them, have been around for a very long time. So actually, they've been very, very experienced. They're very, very flexible, and they have been able to devise insurance policies that cater to all the players within the chain, whether that's an operator, a manufacturer, the users themselves. Sometimes we look at users of large geostationary satellites who lease capacity, and also in terms of the interests of investors in any one project. So there are a number of risks that can be covered, which involve obviously first and foremost protecting the value of the asset itself, Obviously, that value is most at risk during the launch period of a project. Typically, if we're looking at a satellite launch, for a satellite manufacturer, it's obviously when they are manufacturing the satellite itself to ensure that it gets to the launch site for its delivery. When we're talking about the manufacture of the satellite, users we've touched on, and of course we have the launch services agencies themselves. So any type of mission is covered. It has been covered for a long time, whether we're looking at the traditional DTH services or science missions. These can be covered. One of the more pertinent risks at the moment is looking at human space flight, which is something that will have to be studied in due course. So this represents, I think this is catering more for the small sat risks. As I said, this represents a scaled down version of those faced by the traditional projects, but I think it neatly encapsulates the kind of hazards that are prevalent at any one time. If we look at the project cycle of any one satellite, which goes from the pre-launch phase all the way through to post-separation and in orbit operations, obviously there are inherent risks that are very particular to satellites before they're launched at the facility, obviously when there are numerous satellites in a clean room. We then have the physical dangers, physical hazards of transiting or transporting the satellites from the facilities to the launch site finally. And finally, obviously, the accumulation of the launch pad when it's prior to the vehicle being fueled. The launch vehicle phase represents the most riskiest element of the project cycle. Our data shows that the most of the losses actually take place during this period. Into post-separation from the launch vehicle itself, this covers the moment of the separation from the launch vehicle until a defined moment in time. Our typical policies would traditionally look at launch plus the first year or 5 years, etc., in orbit. So this could cover the first contact or until commissioning begins or ends. We then have credit risk. A lot of the time our clients have contractual incentives with successful completion of milestones to ensure that that delivery of the contract is successful. But we also have third-party liability. A lot of launching states have absolute liability under the Outer Space Treaty. So this is actually one of the mandatory insurance coverages for operators from certain launching states.
1 minute, Miguel. Thank you.
Sure thing. So just quickly turning to the characteristics of small sats themselves. Obviously, we've all seen the numbers that commercial space is estimated to be worth anything between 800 billion to 1.1 trillion by 2040. Obviously, we have the new trend of democratization of access to space, commercial off-the-shelf hardware, and obviously this translates into lower values, but there is a case for insuring these projects. It just involves obviously being more flexible towards providing an insurance solution, and that's our role. So looking at the unique risks, obviously space debris has always been an issue, but in light of the lack of licensing at the moment, this is something that's being studied, so it may well become pertinent. So the small sats themselves, obviously we have the issue of the lack of heritage with commercial off-the-shelf hardware, which could lead to expensive solutions or a lack of solutions at the moment if it is deemed too expensive to insure. And probably an interesting stat is that around 15 to 20% of CubeSats are lost before commissioning is complete. And shortly after that, another 35 or 40% suffer some sort of loss afterwards. So just to round off on this one, both myself as a broker and the underwriters within the industry, it is our mission to offer solutions to cater to this sub-industry. There is certainly a need to provide those solutions. We understand that that revenues cannot be produced until a satellite is functioning in orbit, and luckily we now have solutions that cater to that. So just to round off, as we all know, we've all heard the motive that space is hard. and insurance is there to help you in your journey. We're not as I said, we play a very, very important role. We're very interested in hearing from you, especially for new projects. We're seeing a lot of innovation, and luckily the insurance industry has proved very innovative over the years. So our ultimate goal is to help you retire risk and minimize the total cost of that risk. And ultimately, in the event of a loss, is to manage claims as of when they arise. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Miguel. Can you share the screen, and then we can start with the questions? So I have an anonymous question here. I'm going to read it out. Is it possible to obtain insurance for the first flight of a new launch vehicle?
It's a very good question. It is always, I always believe it is possible to insure, to obtain insurance for anything really, but it just depends on providing the most amount of information that you possibly can. Obviously, I've got an insurer who's going to come on next, who's probably well placed to provide his opinion. But as long as there is, the information is there, as long as there is an understanding by the client that the cost may be a bit higher than for a traditionally established launch vehicle, then I believe there is a possibility of getting insurance for that.
Thank you. I'm gonna skip Ramesh's question to later. Ramesh, keep it on the Q&A window. I'll ask later. Can I have Elizabeth Fonarellas to speak and ask the question? I'm going to allow you to speak in a second, Elizabeth. Let me just find you on the window here. So Elizabeth Fonarellas. Elizabeth, can you speak? Elizabeth? No, okay, maybe she's not able to speak, so I'm gonna read the question out. So, is space insurance still facing constraints in capacity?
It's a very interesting question. I'm sure you all know that there have been an increased cadence of losses, especially catastrophic losses, within the last 18 months. Capacity has always been volatile within space. It's been increasing over the years. It's always proved that actually a volatile class of business, but it has been a very profitable line of business in comparison to the other lines of, let's say, the likes of marine insurance, aviation insurance. There's actually been a very, very well, a class of business that's been performing very well over the years. Now, of course, when an external event happens in combination with space losses, it's important to understand that a lot of the capacity that underwrites space risks, they are all, a lot of the times they participate on the same risks. So any one big loss can directly impact what we call the placing of a risk for the next launch. So an incident affects us all. It affects us, as it affects the underwriters. It affects the pricing. It affects the earning of the broker's commission as well, because we cannot earn the money that our price until a satellite is launched. So capacity is always evolving. We're yet to see whether it's going to be directly impacted as a result of recent events, but COVID-19, I expect, let's say, won't have a positive effect on capacity.
All right, thank you for that. We're going to move on to Morten. So if you can take your video off, Miguel, and Morten, can you come on board? You can share your screen as well with your presentation. You can start any point in time now. Thank you so much. You need to unmute as well.
I am unmuted and you should all hear me. So thank you, Tony, for organising this, and good afternoon to everyone. I just want to again just sort of thank you, Tony, for. I thought when these first webinars came out, I thought it was a brilliant idea. I want to repeat that, and I also think it's almost a year ago that we had an inaugural conference in Harwell. It's very good to see that ACCESS.SPACE is going on and progressing. So you should now all see my screen, I hope. So Tony introduced me briefly. My name is Morten Pahle. I have a background, started as a space engineer. I worked for what is now ACCESS Defence and Space on some low Earth orbit imaging satellites. I turned to the dark side in 2001 and joined the space insurance world. I then briefly went back to Airbus, and I was the risk manager for the space part for a couple of years before again come back to the space insurance world in 2008. So I've been on both sides of the fence, always capably squeezing the broker who ends up between the client and the insurer, and they do an interesting job, which I'll come back to. And of course, you heard Miguel earlier, they are the interface between the client and the ultimate product provider. So as a new space company, what could possibly go wrong? Now, people often see insurance as an additional cost, as something that they need to buy just in case something goes wrong. I'd like to see insurance as a little bit different. I'd like to see insurance as something which with a bit of intelligent risk management, a company can use to maximize a business plan in terms of minimizing the volatility, hopefully maybe even be able to sell more products with a suitable protection strategy behind that. And basically to use insurance as a positive side. So that's how I'm going to try to run through risks that a typical company might face, whether you're new space or old space, or in fact, whether you're just any other company. And maybe some sort of angles on that, what's specific to space, what's specific to new space, and how maybe we can do something better than just buying what we think we need. So first of all, sort of the risk environment, as we all know, is everywhere. Investors may or may not be there, customers may or may not be there, competitors will certainly be there, regulators tend to be there rather more than we would like, and lots of things we can't control. Accidents happen, people are people, weather, technology development, especially for startups, is clearly a key challenge for all of us, and all these combine to really make being a startup difficult. Now, of course, no one who is risk averse will be an entrepreneur. So I assume that most people on this call working for the new space companies have a certain appetite for risk. And the boat image on the right sort of is meant to show that a boat such as this is very pretty, standing on a trailer in your garden. It's very, very safe, but doesn't serve much of a purpose. If you don't take any risk, you have a very, very safe boat, but you don't get any joy out of it. And I think we are, to some degree, all risk takers. The question is how much risk we take, but we also have sort of a skewed approach to risks. Risks that we are familiar with, we are quite capable and comfortable with, and maybe we take more risks than we like, even if we do think we can manage them. Whereas risks we don't know much about, maybe we're too averse to and actually try to overprotect ourselves too much. So as engineers, and typically technology startups are driven by engineers, technical risks in terms of development and research, we're very good at. Programmatic risks like schedule, we're maybe not so good at. And some of the other risks that are beyond that, we're maybe not very good at all. So as Miguel just hinted at earlier, in a risk management process, of course, the first step is to be aware. The second step is to manage. And possibly when we go through that process, we see that we can actually take some additional risks that we didn't think of to begin with. And if we take those risks and manage them properly, maybe potentially mitigate them and structure them properly, we can get some benefits out of it. And then finally also, because this is important for all of us, and I think especially in today's environment where capital and finance potentially could become challenging if it hasn't been already, is that investors like companies who can show that they have thought about and reached, let's say, mature conclusions about the risks they take and how they manage them. So just to run through some of the run-of-the-mill risks. I mean, property damage is an obvious one. The icons here sort of they reflect what's known as flexor risk: fire, lightning, explosion, aircraft impact. The kind of thing that basically causes damage to your property, and everyone normally insures their own property. It's an obvious one. What's less obvious, and typically for companies like manufacturers, etc., is that the work that you are working on is typically not insured on the normal property policy. So whereas if you have a fire, your facilities will be rebuilt, the project you're working on, a satellite, may not be rebuilt. and also the work in progress damage through accidents, i.e. you drop a screwdriver on it or it falls off the table, is also typically not covered by your property damage insurance. So that's something to be aware of. Then there's also the issues regarding when your equipment is elsewhere, or the equipment that comes in that may have an issue and causes damage to yours. Is that kind of thing covered by your policy? In space, where typically we have lots of different suppliers, we integrate things depending on the level of the food chain you're in. That's also something to look at and discuss with your broker and insurer to make sure that you actually have cover for losses that may happen and concern you financially, or that they're caused by someone else's equipment on your premises. Test facility, you send stuff off to be tested, it gets damaged. Most test facilities don't take much liability for damages they makes to equipment they are testing. So you may want to think about keeping your own insurance in place for that. And this comes down to, and I'll touch a bit later on, sort of contracts, to be very clear about whose risk of loss is it? Is it yours? Is it a supplier? Is it the client? And then in space, you have a special trick as well, which is the property damage because your product just doesn't work. There are very few other lines of business where if your product doesn't work, that leads to an insurance claim. If your car doesn't work, you may need to repair it. But that's not normally the manufacturer's problem. Or it can be for cars, of course, is the warranty. And in space, on the other hand, if you operate a satellite that you've bought and it just doesn't work, that becomes your problem. And it typically can't be repaired. So there are space-specific policies available, not if it breaks, but just if it fails to work. And Miguel touched on those. The typical, the launch and in-orbit policies cover for when the launcher doesn't work or the satellite doesn't work. That's quite special for space. Third-party damage, everyone talks a lot about. Luckily, in space, once you're in space, third-party damage is difficult because there are very few third parties in close proximity to what you're doing, which doesn't stop the regulators from requiring third-party liability insurance to be in place, but the actual risk is quite low. For launch, the risk is more obvious and it's clearly there. There are the sort of more general third-party liability covers, which every technology company has, which means that visitors to your site may become injured if they receive a dose of radiation, or if something falls on their head, or if they trip up on your doorstep. That's more standard, and there's no real space specialty about it. What is interesting maybe for some of us is that the third-party liability that you may attract really depends on where you are and or where the person who suffers property damage or injury comes from. So the jurisdiction under which you may attract liability could be very different from the jurisdiction you're used to operating in. So with space being very much a worldwide industry, it's worth bearing in mind that you should be aware of some liability that you may have in some jurisdictions you may not think about. Business interruption, of course, this is today a big hot potato. Lots of things can cause business interruption. We heard the Orbit speaking about one earlier. And the problem with business interruption is that, of course, you have expenses that continue, whereas your income goes down or sometimes dries up completely. In addition, and especially in new space nowadays, which is full of, I'd say, startups or companies which have still to generate positive cash flow, is that many companies depend on getting to market quickly. They want to be in the market first, the first mover advantage. Business interruption, if it hits, can therefore not just lead to a delay in the cash flow, but actually ruin the entire business plan. Business interruption can be caused by yourself having an accident, and be caused by external effects like we're seeing at the moment with the pandemic, but also by your suppliers and clients who may be late in delivering things. So again, looking at protecting how you can protect that to avoid a problem elsewhere becoming your problem is important to most companies. And also the increased cost of working. So if you've had a business interruption, then you normally try to catch up, and that has extra costs by working double shifts, etc. That's also a cost which the company will have to bear and which protection is available for. In space, there's a bit of a special case, and that's business interruption or delay in general can cause you to miss a launch, or if you're on a science project to Mars, for instance, or a conjunction of planets, which obviously has a potential big impact. If you're giving advice or selling products, which most of us are, then there is a product liability that may attach. The diagram of a bottle there refers to the very first, well, a famous legal case, which was a slug in a beer bottle that sort of created the product liability doctrine in the UK. And it means that you remain responsible for your product, even if you sell it and it's sold through someone else to someone else. You, as the initial manufacturer, remain responsible for your product and damage it may cause to others, even if they use it in a way which is not intended. Again, in space, that is quite remote. But if you're an equipment manufacturer of GSC or something else, it could well be relevant. If you sell equipment that a prime manufacturer uses wrongly and it damages the work he's working on, then in theory you're liable for that. So those are things to look at. Similarly, if you are giving advice and things go wrong, and as a little sort of in brackets, investors also rely on you to do the sensible thing. So if there is a so-called directors and officers liability, which may arise if they feel that you've not done what you should have done. So there's a liability you have towards your investors as well, beyond potential or the investment you have. So contracts, of course, this is what we all think. Okay, so I have all these risks, but I can manage them through contract. Which is true to some degree. If you have decent contracts, then at least you will be very aware of the risks you have, and it should hopefully be limited between you and your contracting party. Of course, risks you have or liabilities you have through third parties, you cannot manage through a contract because you don't have a contract with a third party. So that risk you will retain. In space, though, there is as well, not just in space, but what we do have in some contracts is an indemnity clause. So in space, you see them in launch contracts mostly, which is where parties not just limit each other's liability, but also agree to indemnify each other for claims made towards any of them by a third party. This is quite useful in that it allows basically one party to take, or a party to take the risk and insure it out, as opposed to potentially 10 different parties having each their insurance contract. So indemnity clauses is something that everyone should be aware of and find out what they mean and how you can use them to your benefit. And it's really, it's difficult to overstress how important it is to have a coherent policy on the risks that you're willing to accept, the risks which you're not willing to accept in a contract, and how you want to push things through reasonably so to have to be left with something which is clear. And unambiguous and fair to all parties concerned. So to then briefly look at this particular space covers, which Miguel mentioned earlier. So what remains specific to space and is not just a high-tech risk, is that ultimately it ends up going into orbit or at least into suborbital launches or similar. Assembly integration test, like I mentioned earlier, very few normal property policies would cover the work in progress going on unless there's an extension to the policy. And traditional insurers may then not be very keen on covering space in equipment because they don't know much about it. So AIT and also transit, there is a small market for in the space insurance market who feel more comfortable with those risks, and who are probably able to provide better conditions and also better understand in case of a claim what's happened and what to do about it. Pre-launch is obviously a very specific space risk. So it typically covers AIT at the launch site up to and including, or up to the launch command being sent. The launch part, of course, is very clear, which typically goes from ignition of the engines through to separation. So it's really the launcher performance which is insured, and then in-orbit life of the satellite thereafter. And this is what I mentioned earlier about the failure to function. Basically, if a satellite fails to perform, then that is something that is covered. And then on the last two parties, on the last two types of risks, so the associated liability with the launch and the in-orbit liability is easily insured, or easily, I say, it's available as an insurance cover. So, as I mentioned earlier, every textbook will tell you that the role of insurance is to return the insured to the financial position he had been in had the loss not occurred. So one point here is the word financial. That is ultimately all insurance can do. It cannot protect your market reputation. It cannot buy you extra time. It can just give you some money back. And also, this is all very negative. This is all focused on losses and bad things happening. I like to think of insurance a little bit more positive, like I mentioned. So I like to think that insurance enables innovation and development by taking on those risks which commercial enterprise cannot take themselves. Britain would not have developed an empire spanning the world if the trading ships were not insured against loss, for instance. And this is what I like to think that we can still do. So in space specifically, we want to enable all you guys to grow the space sector, which is good for you, good for us. And we want to take the risks off your books and put them on our books, so which enables you to do better business and hopefully be successful. So this is a long list which I'm not going to read through. There's a couple, and you can download this, or not download. You can replay this later on the website. It is worth thinking on the special things that you do, which most other high-tech companies don't do, and to make sure that you have the cover in place you need for your actual risks once you have reviewed your risk. And then look at some of the specific space ones. So launch delays, or delays in general, is a key issue that may not be relevant for many pure terrestrial companies. The obvious launch and in orbit is clear. But ultimately, what you should be aware of at the bottom point here is that insurance can be used for a lot of things, and to make your business plans safer and to, like I said, devolatilize it. But it cannot take the entrepreneurship risk or the business risk. Again, no insurance can ensure that you will actually be able to meet your sales targets. How to engage with insurance markets. So there should have been a bit of overlap between what I'm saying and what Miguel is saying. So Miguel works for a broker, and he will ultimately act on your behalf or on behalf of the insured, and interface with the insurers like me, who will act on behalf of the insurers. Our underwriters, such as myself, we make decisions on behalf of our insurance companies on the risks that we underwrite and the rates we have and the conditions that we apply. So brokers should understand the industry. They should be able to communicate with you, and you should feel comfortable that they understand what you need, and also they can support you in case of a claim. Brokers should also be the first, I'd say, sanity check with respect to what you can and cannot insure. But ultimately, they do not insure you. So they may also sometimes be overly optimistic. Miguel was very positive about ensuring a maiden flight of the first launch. I agree, that has been done. It is not unheard of, but there are lots of conditions that may make it very difficult or very expensive to do so. Ultimately, it's the underwriters who decide what to insure and what not to insure. But we too need to be at the level where you feel comfortable with us, what we know, and that ultimately, in case of a claim, that you believe that we will understand what you need and be able to help you get the claim settled really quickly. Talking to both us and the brokers, transparency and communication are very important, and I think Michelle touched on this as well. The more we know, the better we can rate the risk. The less we know, the more uncertain we see things, and uncertainty always has a price. In general, even if it's a very challenging risk, you will get a better result if you tell us about all the challenges and how you manage them than if you let us do the guesswork. Most of our insurers, if not all, not quite all, but most of the insurers have a technical background. And I think we're also quite human enough that we enjoy working on interesting projects. So challenging projects are something we thrive on, and we should also be able to assist you in designing the coverage, because we do see quite a broad spectrum of insureds and their challenges in general.
One more minute, Morten, please.
Perfect. So this brings me to the one slide I have on my presentation, which really tells me a bit more about what we do and what we offer. So I mentioned before, we are underwriters, and my background is technical. So I changed 2 years ago to start at Volante, the ACCESS underwriting group, and we developed a product for the new space market, which we call the Bifrost facility. So Bifrost was the rainbow in Norse mythology that connected the heaven and the earth. And for us, Bifrost is more trying to enable new space companies to get into space. So Bifrost combines or provides a facility with all the type of covers that you may require for your project. So from the very early days of a project lifecycle, assembly, integration, testing, through the transits, through the pre-launch, launch in orbit, possibly de-orbit as well, and the third-party liabilities. And we can then also add some specific things like launch delay, financial consequences, and other special covers as you want. The idea with having a facility is that you will get certainty of cover within a framework. You don't have to come talk to your insurer every time you have a new risk. As long as your risk fits within a framework, you just have to tell us about it, and then it's automatically covered. It also provides a premium certainty, because you'll have certainty about how much your cover is going to cost you before you do it. And it can also provide it as a budgeting certainty. If you tell us roughly how many risks you're going to have over the next 12 or 24 months, you can pay your premium in a regular fashion, which makes it an operational expense instead of a capex, typically linked to launch, which may be cash flow difficult. We also put in a facility then, and this is recognizing the challenges of insuring new spaces, that it is new. Insurers don't like new things generally because we have little heritage to go on. So we want to align our interests by getting to know your products, seeing as many of them, and over time, we will then give you back premium based on no claims bonuses and pre-agreed rate reductions and discounts to your premium if you actually build up the business as you said you would. So for instance, if you have a launch on a first launcher, we will charge you a certain rate for that. But if we know that tomorrow you'll come back to us with a second launch on that launcher, a third and a fourth and a fifth launch, we can in advance agree how that rate is going to reduce launch by launch by launch, so that you get a reduction in the rate that you pay as your experience goes well, but we also get a certain protection if there is an early issue. The facility also makes it easy to declare what you launch and how you launch it. It doesn't have to be launch, it could be transits, it could be just exposures for AIT or storage. And of course, what we hope to bring is that you deal with one insurer who understands you and cares about your risks, and who sees this as a very interesting area to be in, and who you are important to. So that's Bifrost. That's all I had to say, really. So I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. Can you unshare the screen, please? And we'll start with the questions. Hamza Baig, would you be able to ask your question? Can you unmute and speak?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, of course. Can you present yourself, where you're from and what you do, and then ask the question, please.
Yeah, I'm based in Australia, Melbourne. I'm the founder of Space Dynamics Marketing. I provide marketing services to the space and satellite industry and the service providers.
Go ahead, ask a question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is that usually what is the premium range of new small satellite launchers compared to the traditional launchers?
Shall I take that, Tony?
Yeah, go ahead. It's yours. All yours.
Because in theory, both Miguel and myself can answer that. But so for the time being, most small sats we've seen are launched on traditional launchers, as you would say, on a Soyuz, on a Vega, on a PSLV, and they pay a very similar rate to what SES or Intelsat would pay on those launchers. Of course, we have seen the one active launcher we see is the Electron by Rocket, which is launched very well, and I think is up to 11 or 12 successful launches now. I think in the marketplace that's rated around 5-6% or so for a launch. The others we have seen plans for include Virgin, etc. They've not, to my knowledge, they may have been placed on the market with some insurers at relatively high rates because they haven't launched yet. And I would disagree with Miguel in that a maiden launch is difficult to insure. I think, and I also think most launch providers recognize that, and the maiden launch tends to be a demo launch, which is not commercially insured. But then from launch 2 and onwards, it depends on the technology used on the launcher, on the sum insured, and rates should become reasonable quite quickly, especially at the launch rates that some of the launch providers are expecting, which is almost a launch a month, if not more. So at that point, launch rates should quite quickly come down to where Electron is, or even lower.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, Morten and Hamza is obviously looking at it from a broker's point of view, which is obviously always going to be slightly nuanced compared to an insurer's. But I'm hesitant to put any percentage rate on any any one launch vehicle, because touching on what Morten said before, and in terms of external events affecting rates, the space insurance market is a volatile one. It's an animal. It's an animal that's alive, and it's very sensitive to losses. So a rate that you may see now, if you're asking for let's say a range of magnitude price, may very well change if there is a failure on the next launch of an entirely different launch vehicle that's completely unrelated to the one you're looking at, and that's primarily because there's what we call a lack of homogeneity in risks. There are a very, very limited amount of risks, and predominantly all the insurers that participate on any one risk will have what we call a slice of the risk. So if there's a loss on an Ariane or a Vega launch vehicle, then somewhere along the line within the next few months, because that's produced a loss to that insurer, then it will have a direct impact on the price, because insurers will judge the price on a number of factors. One is the heritage of the launch vehicle or the satellite itself. If you're looking at that, if you're looking at the post-separation risk. They also look at what we call the premium versus claims ratio for the year. So obviously, as an insurance company, you base your profits on the premiums being higher than the claims. So there will be an internal pressure, obviously, to produce profits. That's naturally obviously the end game, is to make sure that prudent underwriting produces a good business result. So as I said, I'm hesitant to put any number on any percentage rate on any new launch vehicle, because it can vary depending on the risk appetite of the insurer.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Miguel. One last question for Morten before we move to the general Q&A session. Peter the Selding, would you like to ask the question yourself online? I'm going to put you on the speaker in a second. Let me find you. Peter, you online? I should be able to hear you now. Peter, you able to speak? Okay, I'm going to read the question because I don't hear you. Insurance rates rose substantially in the late 2019, early this year, following large claims and years of decline in premium as a percentage of insured value. Have underwriters generally held to these higher rates? And will the lower number of 2020 launches with COVID-19 make it more or less likely that individual underwriters reduce rates to get market share? Morten, is all yours. Unmute, please, Morten.
Yeah, so and I think I saw another question of similar ilk, and someone quoted the famous letter from ELSCO that went out a couple of months ago, I think, about capacity and cost of capacity, etc. So first of all, as everyone probably heard, last year there were lots of large losses. That's very untechnical. There were several large losses related to launch and in orbit. This year there have also been some large losses. Losses, of course, tend to make insurers push the premium up. And that is likely to continue. The major loss was the Vega loss, launch failure, which was in July last year. There was a big jump in rates after that. I think we will also see that 1 year on, and now that we've had 1 year to digest that, rates are continuing to increase above that. So that's continuing. I don't think that is necessarily the result of COVID-19. COVID-19 has had the impact of delaying some commercial launches, which clearly has a cash impact. I think we've all seen some clients are slightly more careful in placing large insurance placements early, so they're waiting a little bit to see how the market reacts. But I think that is a delay effect. It's not an overall big effect. And I'm not sure I see a direct impact from COVID-19 on that level. However, and going back to this note that was sent out, as referred to by Thomas, I think, the general insurance industry clearly is, I wouldn't say struggling, but the COVID-19 is a big challenge for the insurance industry. The cost of capital, not just for insurance, but for finance in general, is changing. And that may affect the capital available to insurers, but we have not seen any real issues with that. I think space is space does not accumulate with many other lines of business. So space often lives in a bit of a bubble on its own, and the attractiveness of space is typically judged on its own merits and its own results, which is why things like launch failures on Vega or launch failures on Chinese launchers or in-orbit failures, they do impact the space market. Overall global effects clearly also have an impact, but I would say it's secondary. So for now, I would expect to continue to see insurance premiums increase slightly for the next maybe 12 to 18 months. But I could be proven wrong. I don't know. I think what's important for the new space community especially is that for your risks, the challenge to you is not the overall market status. The challenge to you is the unusual aspect of your risks and the fact that insurers don't necessarily know much about you or your products, and it's a communication challenge you have, which is why people like me are here to listen to and to join the webinars and to learn about, because we want to overcome that challenge as much as you do. I think that for new space is more important than the actual overall market, global events that affect everyone. And also the communication aspect is something that you can manage, whereas the global state of the insurance market, neither you nor I can do much about.
Thank you, Morten. I'm going to now open up the Q&A. We have about 5 minutes left. We may go over time if people allow it, to the full panel. Maybe if each one of you can show yourself. Bruno, we're on your, yeah, thank you so much, your speaker, your microphone. I'm going to ask a question to Bruno. I know that Moin Hamid is the Secretary General of IMSO here in the UK, had a question. Maybe Bruno could answer that. Bruno, Moin asked the question on what are the hazards the satellites are subject to space? What are the sort of generic hazards and problems that could happen in space for satellites?
Well, there's radiation, there's solar flares, there's all the physical constraints on thermal variations, which are very wide between sun and shadow and sun and eclipse. And then there are obviously potentially technical glitches generated by that radiation and by those flares. And then there are constraints on things like debris. So small piece of debris can cause a lot of damage on a satellite, which is not necessarily trackable if it's below a few centimeters. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges up there. It's a harsh environment. Tony?
Oh, sorry. Yes, my microphone. Yes, I'm gonna now move on to the Q&A list I have here. I'm going to read out the questions to be more faster. Ramesh Gupta asked a question earlier. I'm going to put it up to the panel to answer. Any one of you could do that. If you, Miguel and Morten, you can unmute yourself as well. So Ramesh Gupta asked the question, says, last year was very challenging from the space insurance point of view because a number of high-profile failures. How is 2020 shaping up so far? I think it's part of the question that Peter's asked, but is there anything else you want to say on this point for Ramesh? Unmute yourself, Morten. If not, I'm going to move on to the next question.
Not really beyond what I said. 2020 so far, there's been a couple of losses. There's been a premium income which has been, depending on how we account premium, whether it's when the risk attaches, so to speak. So a launch policy is placed 2 years before launch. Do we account for the premium when the placement is made 2 years before launch or when the launch happens? So depending on how you account for the premium income, there is less premium than losses so far this year, which is clearly not good news. But if you account for it differently, then there is more premium than losses. So we always, when you see insurance loss statistics and premium income statistics, you need to be aware that there's different ways of presenting it. But I would say that 2020 is not a good year in terms of losses, but it is also not horrific. So it shows that the rates are probably thin and I think that is why the rates are still being pushed up slightly.
All right. So unless Miguel has anything to say, I'll move on to the next question. Anonymous question asking, what are the requirements to be a space insurance broker? Can it be a single person's role? Miguel?
Very good question. Very, very good question. Yeah, I think it's easier to answer the second point, the second part of that question, which is I don't think you can be a one-man, what we call a one-man band, to be a space insurance broker. I think you need to have technical support, as I said, especially if you're looking at the sort of the larger operators. You need to understand the language of a satellite operator. As Morten has touched on before, a lot of the underwriters and a lot of the brokers come from a very technical high technical background, whether that's working for an operator, whether that's working for one of the industry big players. In terms of becoming an insurance broker itself, I'd say from my point of view, it's a very, very rewarding role. You get the chance. A space insurance broker is very different from a very simple, I'm not going to say simple, but an insurance broker for other lines of business, in that you have to understand all the entire satellite chain, whether that's the final consumer, whether that's the underwriters, and you need to know the tendencies as well. And provided you can have a enthusiasm for space, which I think is absolutely vital, and providing you're a very good people person and obviously capable of taking on a lot of technical information, then absolutely, I think anyone who wants to get in is a very, very rewarding role.
All right, thank you for that. I have a question which is going to include also Bruno's company here. How do you rate a new risk like the orbit ion dispenser mechanism? So before you answer that, Morten or Miguel, maybe Bruno could add something to this question.
Yeah, someone asked before about the challenges of marketing a service, and part of the challenge is to market something that hasn't flown yet. So the first question is, has it been proven? Has it been fly? Did it fly already? And that's the first step for our customers, future customers, and those are the questions that we get asked by insurers. So, I mean, someone touched on this, I think it was Morten, about business continuity. I mean, we had the delay from Vega, and we were supposed to have launched on the Vega launch in September. So we were affected because of the failure in June. So that gives us an uncertainty about revenue that we expect. So we didn't get a date in March, and then we get a further delay of another couple of months, which at the time when we left Kourou, we didn't know when that we could reschedule the flight, to the point where we consider other options in terms of other launcher providers that could still fly with. But then the challenge is how we get the satellite out of Kourou, how we get our payload out of Kourou. So it wasn't practical. But the biggest impact is on the second flight. So we already have customers, paying customers on a second flight that is currently scheduled to December on a SpaceX flight. And they're waiting to see what happens in the first one. So we have customers on the second flight that would be nervous to fly, and they would potentially pull out if we don't get the first one right. So it's a domino effect, which I think is also what Morten was alluding to in terms of the flight proven heritage. And it's true for the space market as a whole. I mean, that is something that is inherent from, and this is why I say new space or old space. I mean, everybody's going to be looking at heritage. Everybody's going to be looking at with some, I wouldn't call it skepticism as a new concept, but they will want to see proven before they commit to it. And this creates a lot of inertia into the technical innovations, I suppose. People will be weighing off risks in terms of can we try something that people are not going to buy because they haven't seen this fly or because it's not been proven. It's a tricky situation. It's a loophole that we look to insurances also to try to help us, particularly with the cash issues or the financials, which is obviously something that's very important for a new space company and a venture-backed company. but it's the risk. And I'll let the insurances answer the rest of the question. Sorry if I took so long.
Yeah, there's no black or white answer. I just wanted to quickly detour business interruption due to launch failure. The example Bruno gave, for instance, Vega had launch failure last year. Therefore, their first mission has been delayed. That's an insurable event. So if you as a business are really exposed to delay that may be caused by launch failure, that's something you may want to talk to a broker or a friendly insurer even.
We actually look at the options as well. As I said, we looked at options to try to see how we could put it on another flight, because and at the time it was a valid option to get it out of Vega because Vega failed. So. And so it's something that it's tricky to manage on our side as well. So particularly because it was also a first mission to demonstrate it, and it creates other ripple effects that are not necessarily manageable from an insurance point of view. It's also from a technical point of view, which is interesting to relate these two things, I suppose.
Yeah. So that's a general interesting thing for us to look at.
We had some funny remarks because we had. Not just for ourselves, but other people flying on this upcoming Vega launch, which is going to be the first one after the failure. And because Vega had a 100% success rate, which is unheard of. So now that they failed, are we safe? So it's one of those things that it's statistically doesn't work like that with the probabilities. But it's a fun remark that we heard ourselves on people flying with us.
Well, Bruno, just one question on that one. Is there obviously 3U satellites and above that? Is there an ability? I'm not talking contractually, but are other launch vehicles able to quickly and easily take on? For example, if you see that there's a delay in risk, there's an ability to transfer launch vehicles fairly easily. Is that something that you've studied?
Yes, and this is actually something that we try to do. So on the business case that we have, we plan to launch one ion dispenser every 2-3 months. That means you have flight opportunities every 2-3 months, and we have cutoff dates to load your satellite. And we have customers with very specific orbital needs, so they need to go to that orbital plane. And we have customers that don't necessarily care so much about orbit, so they can fly on every slot that's available. So we try to standardize the interfaces as much as we can, and cubes allow for some of that to happen, not all. But we try to address that, and this is something that we try also to cater for.
So I've just launched a poll for the participants to answer. Just the last question, and then we can end there. Is an insurance?
Sorry, I just thought I would answer the question with respect to how do we rate the orbit, because I think that is potentially useful for everyone else in the room as well. Because insurers, the first question is always, has it flown before? Has the deorbit equipment flown before? And the answer so far is no. That's difficult. The question is, has deorbit as a company built anything else before that has flown that we've seen? I'm not aware of that. So the next step going down is, has something like what deorbit is producing been manufactured and flown before, and what's the experience of that? There we can start looking at other dispenser mechanisms from other manufacturers and used on other launchers. And then, so it's that sort of first step. And then this is the same for any new projects. Lots of new space projects we've not seen. People are proving themselves first time around. Of course we haven't seen them. They often have a background. They come from other companies where they've done something. That's useful for us to know. If you worked in another industry or in the space industry before and you worked on another project, that's useful because it gives us a credibility or a feeling of credibility in what you do and how you do it. And then, although we all like to think that we're doing something that's completely new and no one else has done before, often it has been done before, but a little bit differently, or maybe not as good, or maybe a bit heavier or a bit more expensive. So there is heritage at some level that again, we would like to look down and look at. So when it comes to talking to insurers, try to draw on all those things, try to say that, okay, we've not done this before, but they've done it and we're better than them because we have more people from another company, for instance. All those relative things, they are useful for us to not just assess the risk, but also to create sort of a justification for why we should believe in it. So deorbit, I look forward to having more chats with Bruno, and I look forward to our clients who could give us more information about deorbit. But ultimately, also, what does it do? Is it really complex? And
What I find interesting, Morten, is that it also, your description aligns with our own assessment, because we did fly a mission in 2017 to de-risk some of the technologies of stuff that we wanted to fly now. So we launched our own cube, developed by ourselves, and the concept was about the same mechanisms to operate ION. And again, even our lessons learned from that mission, which was a small mission, we're taking into account and how you scale that up, and not just on the hardware itself, but also on the ground, how we manage that integration, how we manage the requirements that are fed into the next mission. And the one that we have lined up for December is already taking lessons learned from the previous one into account. And this is a snowball for the iterative process for new space companies is quick as well, or we try to be quick. Which aligns with your, breaking it in smaller chunks that you can manage risk from a business perspective as well, which is all important for us and for our shareholders and stakeholders that want to invest and give us cash to do something that will generate something out of it.
Okay, I think we've finished. We're over time by 15 minutes. I think it was a great session, and the last 15 minutes has been sort of a dialogue between yourselves. Thank you so much for presenting today to the panelists, as well as thank you so much to the people that attended this meeting, this sort of webinar. I hope you come to join us next week, and have a nice week and have a nice weekend. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.